when I was at the chiropractor.
Okay, I
One of my
want to
note
say
pages
thank
flew
you
out of
to all of you for braving the elements to hear our speaker tonight. We've had quite a lineup of speakers today. And I just want to say that our topic has been Holocaust, persecution, and refugees. We have been, the Global Awareness Taskforce has been putting on events like this for 18 years, and different faculty and staff participate to make this possible. So I just wanted to give a little recognition to people who helped contribute towards this. Scott Fernandez, Jim Jones, Brent Forsgreen, Jim Norris, Paul Schmidt, and Bonnie Ramchak are all members of the Global Awareness Task Force. So they're the main people that organized this and pulled this off. I would also say that within the administration, we got a lot of support from, I'm trying to think of everybody, Sherry Artman, Pete Lacey, promotions, Martha Pennington, and there were numerous other people that did different things to make this very successful. So I just wanted to give that credit where it was due. And at this point, I'm going to turn this mic over to Scott Fernandez, who will introduce our speaker, Sandra Novacek.
Thank you, Craig. Sandra Novacek is a librarian, writer, editor, and publisher from Detroit, Michigan. After earning a BA in English and Theater from Michigan State University and a Master's in Library Science from Wayne State University, Sandra worked as a high school English and theater teacher and director of the United States Army Education Center in Prüm, Germany, before becoming director of the Croming Library in Heartland, Michigan for 21 years. In 1996, Sandra married Charles Novacek, an artist, writer, and retired civil engineer. Widowed in 2007, Sandra has dedicated herself to fulfilling her late husband's wish for the publication of his memoir, Border Crossings, Coming of Age in the Czech Resistance, a first-hand account of his life spent as a youth in the Czech Resistance during World War II and the Cold War. Endorsed by Madeleine Albright, the memoir has been a winner and/or finalist of 14 awards, including a gold medal for memoir in the 2012 Midwest Book Awards. When she isn't speaking to groups and writing about border crossings, Sandra is seeking ways of getting her husband's story translated and turned into a screenplay and movie. Also, if anybody's interested, Sandra does have copies of the book Border Crossings here tonight, and I'm sure if you ask her nicely, she'll leave an autograph one for you if you'd like to purchase the book after her presentation tonight. So if you'd all join me in a welcome of Sandra Novacek, we'll let her begin.
I'm all set. I brought it. Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine. Otherwise I'll spell it.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming out on a not too pleasant evening. And this is a beautiful, beautiful place. I haven't been to Port Huron, I'm sorry to say, in a long time, and I wish I could stay a little longer. This is a really kind of a special month in terms of the history of my husband Charles and Czechoslovakia. November 12th was the day that he actually set out with 3 of his resistance friends, November 12th of 1948, to leave his homeland, to cross the border, and to escape from the communists. November 17th of this week, and also in 1939, was an important day. We're now celebrating it as International Students' Day, which is an observance of student activism throughout the world. I don't know, maybe that's how this whole week started. I don't know the exact origin of Global Awareness Day or week, but November 17th commemorates the anniversary of the 1939 demonstrations in Prague, Czechoslovakia, by Czech students that were demonstrating against the German Nazi occupation, which resulted in the killing of Jan Apletal, who was a wonderful, aspiring medical student, and he was killed, and the students had a funeral procession which was held on the 15th of November, and there were thousands of students flooding the city of Prague. And they used that as another way to demonstrate against the Nazis. But in a brutal retaliation, the Nazis closed all of the schools, actually universities, the colleges and universities, which had a great effect on, well, my late husband, but also on all the young people that wanted to learn. And you can imagine them closing down this wonderful school would be horrifying. So the Nazis stormed the University of Prague, and more than 1,200 students were jailed, or they were sent to concentration camps, and 9 students were executed without a trial 2 days later on the 17th of November, 1939. This day also has further significance for Czechs, because in 1989, the 50th anniversary of these events sparked the Velvet Revolution, the beginning of the end of communist rule in that country. So this is indeed a very important week. Well, I'm also here today to tell you that love is powerful. Love of a city, love of a family, love of parents. Love is powerful. It can make you do things you never thought you would do. Love of God, love of country, love of neighbors, love of a woman, love of a friend, love of a child, love of freedom, and love of a man. When I was 49 years old, I sold my house, I quit my job, and I married a man 20 years my senior, whom I had only known for 4 months. Yes, love was powerful. It can make you, it made me do things I never thought that I would do. It also made me publish the book of my beloved Charles. A lot of people, when I do presentations on this book, they wonder, what is this woman doing, up here talking about the Czech Resistance? Well, this book was actually written by my husband and I published it, but all the words are Charles. I'd like to let you know a little bit about how we met and how the book came to be and how I was able to learn so much about Charles' history. As Scott said, I'm a librarian, and this is how our story begins. This is part of the library that I worked in, the Cromain Library in Heartland. I had 2 library patrons that were artists, and it just so happened that Charles Novacek had retired, and he had said that when he retired, he would go to art school, because as I said to you earlier, in 1939, Hitler closed all the colleges and universities. He closed the art school, and Charles had wanted to be an artist, and he never could go to art school as a child. So when he retired, he went back to school, and one of his teachers was actually a library patron of mine. Her name was Electra, and she had a friend named Lula, and Lula was the local high school art teacher. Well, they both knew Charles pretty well. Charles and his wife had gotten to know Electra and her husband socially. And when Charles' wife, his first wife, who was a Latvian refugee, became very ill and passed away, the art teachers were very sad, of course, and they did everything they could to try to console Charles. Charles spent a lot of time alone for a few years, and finally, one day, he went to Electra and said, Electra, you know, I really wish you could help me out. I'm lonely. I'd really like to meet someone. And he had a whole list of specifications of what he wanted a particular companion to do or be. And so he gave that list to Electra, and she got her friend Lula, the two art teachers, and Lula came to my library one day and she said, Sandy, there's this wonderful man. His name is Charles Novacek, and he's a retired civil engineer. He was born in Czechoslovakia. He actually lived in Venezuela. He has a house in Venezuela. He's an artist. He's just a Renaissance man. He can do all sorts of things. And I think you should meet him. And he's looking for a companion. Would you be interested? And I said, oh no. I had been divorced for several years. I was very, very busy. Our library was changing its structure from a school district-owned public library to a public library, and I was working 6 and sometimes 7 days a week. And I just felt it was just too much. So I refused. But as I was walking away, it occurred to me that, you know, what did I do when I was in college and somebody asked me out and I didn't want to go? I would just tell them no. So I thought, well, I can go out with this man one time and see what happens. So I turned back to Lula and said yes. Well, a few weeks later, I was in my kitchen, and actually with my first husband. We had a civil relationship. We had no children, but we had joint custody of our dog, a beautiful Blue Merle Collie that we had to have put to sleep. And so we were taking the dog to the veterinarian that day, and just as we were walking out the door, the telephone rang. And of course, this is before cell phones and everything, and normally if the phone had rung, I would just let it go. But there was something that day that made me just want to pick up the phone and answer it. And I did. And on the other end of the line was a beautiful voice of a man with a slight accent, and I immediately knew that it must be Charles Novacek, and he of course introduced himself. And I quickly told him what was going on with the dog, and he explained that he had had a similar thing happen to him a few weeks previously and was very sympathetic, but was a little pushy and said, well, when are you going to be home? And I said, I don't know. And finally I said, okay, about 9 o'clock tonight. And so at about 1 minute after 9 that evening, he called me. And that's how our story started. And that's really when I first started to really learn about Charles. Charles had an idyllic childhood. His story of his youth was beautiful. It was a story of a Czechoslovakian boy whose idyllic childhood was shattered by the Nazi occupation of his homeland. A story of a boy who was in the Czech Resistance at the tender age of 11 until 20 during World War II and the Cold War. It was a story of love of country, love of family, and truly a love of freedom. Most of you know where Czechoslovakia was. It has a very interesting history, which I won't go into too much detail, but it was a country that was really only a country for about 20 years. It was formed in 1918, kind of, you know, as a result of many things that happened during World War I. And one of the leaders, the first president actually, of Czechoslovakia was a man named Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. And Masaryk had been involved with the Czech Legion during World War I. And Charles Novacek's father was a Czech legionnaire. And his father had actually marched across Russia and sailed around the world to come home, you know, at the end of World War I. And Charles' father, Antonin Novacek, idolized Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. Masaryk believed in democracy, and he was actually married to Charlotte Garrigue. She was from Chicago. She was an American. And so Charles' father was aware of that, and he studied a lot of things that Masaryk talked about and wrote about, and learned a lot about the United States when he was a younger man. Charles was born in Oštiny, Slovakia. It was Oštiny, Czechoslovakia. It's now Slovakia because, as most of you know, the country ultimately did dissolve. The country was occupied by the Russians, the communists, and then when the communist rule finally was over in the 90s, the two regions of the former Czechoslovakia, two largest regions, decided to separate and become two separate nations, which are now the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. And so Charles was born in what is now the Slovak Republic, but at that time was Czechoslovakia. This is the town Oštiny. This is a fairly recent picture of Oštiny. This is the house where Charles was born. This is Charles' mom and his sister. He had a sister, Vlasta, who was 3 years older than him. And here, I'm just going to go through a few pictures of him. So you can kind of get a feel for that, you know, he did have a happy childhood. But it was shattered. It was shattered by the occupation of the Nazis. Charles' father, as I mentioned earlier, was in World War I. And at the end of World War I, he was actually, I guess you'd say, ordered to go into the police force. So he actually became what we would probably think of as a state policeman. And in his work, he was kind of shipped around from one city to the other. So, and in the early 20s, like in 1921, that's when he was sent to Oštiny, and that's when he met Charles, who was Charles' mother, Maria. And Maria was actually from Oštiny, and so they were living in her hometown. It was really not too far from the Tatra Mountains. This is actually at the foot of the Tatra Mountains, and they actually lived in the hotel here. It's called Hotel Boston. Never did know how it got that name. Charles didn't know either. And I actually went there with him. But this is where they lived when Charles' father was transferred from Oštiny. And of course, this is the beautiful Tatra Mountains that Charles loved so much. But in 1938, when Charles was 10 years old, you stop and think about it, okay, Hitler had been in power in Germany since 1933, and he had plans, and his plans were, among his plans were to move into Czechoslovakia He had many reasons to do this. For one thing, the country of Czechoslovakia was a very successful country, and it had a lot of good industry. It had the Bata shoe company, it had Skoda. Skoda, manufactured cars, they even did tanks. There was beautiful landforms there. It was just a lovely and very successful place. Also, the borderlands of the country and the edges of the country that were close to Germany had been they were called the Sudetenlands, and those lands had actually been turned over to the country of Czechoslovakia after World War I. And so there were a lot of German people living in that area, and some of them were not happy about it, and Hitler was definitely not happy about it. He wanted to bring those people back to home, to Germany. And so that was his goal, was to do that. And of course, the country of Czechoslovakia didn't want that to happen. And they were hoping that their allies, the British and the French and maybe the Italians, would support them. But Hitler said no, he wanted to take those lands and that they were rightfully, the Germans. And so, a lot of things happened, but basically the bottom line was that the Allies basically did not back the country of Czechoslovakia, and those lands, the Sudetenlands, were turned over to Germany. And I think, this was mostly done out of fear of what might happen, the repercussions of Hitler not getting what he wanted. But what happened, the Munich Agreement was signed. There was a big meeting of the 4 heads of government in Munich, Germany, and the Munich Agreement was signed in September of 1938. And basically, those lands were turned over to the Germans. Well, that totally changed Charles' life, his father's life, his family's life, and everyone else's life, in that part of the world. And what happened to Charles' father was that Hitler had ordered that all men were to go back to their region of origin. So, like I said before, Charles' mom was from Osztany, Slovakia, but his father was from what is now called Moravia, and so that is now part of the Czech Republic. So their family was ordered back to the dad's homeland, and so they had to uproot their home in Slovakia and move there. And this was very traumatic for Charles. Scott and I had been talking earlier about there were a lot of problems for Charles when he had to leave that region. He spoke Slovakian. His native language was Hungarian because that was his mom's native language, but she also spoke Slovakian. His father spoke Czech, so Charles learned Czech as well. So, as a little boy, he spoke, 3 languages. But the kids at school used to make fun of him when he would be living in Osztany and speak Hungarian. And when they moved after the Munich Agreement, he was ostracized a lot as well. It was very difficult for him. So